It's not every day that we almost have a nuclear disaster, especially under circumstances like these. But first, let's talk about another thing which is actually worse in a way, but could happen way more often in the future. Now, I hope that got you interested, because if not, you're probably not even watching this far. If you still are though, allow me to introduce myself. World's News is a channel dedicated to delivering news on a weekly basis. Within each video, we try to pick out the most important or funniest news and explain their origins, development, as well as possible outcomes to inform you about the world you're living in. So let's start with the massive drought, which is currently hitting Europe. But as ironic as it sounds, this topic's a bit dry. You know, that's how important news are. Sometimes there's something as exciting as potential war, and then there's drought. But to make it a bit less boring, I'll also explain where all the water is going. So in the past months, Europe and some other continents as well, but this topic's focus is on Europe, is struck by severe drought. As of July of this year, cumulatively, 64% of Europe is under warning or alert. This drought brings countless consequences which we now have to battle. And I know that many of you don't live in Europe, so why would you have to battle the consequences? Well, that's fairly simple. As we see in the Russo-Ukrainian war, the shortage of everyday goods is no fun. Now imagine this happening in entire Europe, because all the European countries can produce most water-related things. And I'm talking grains, some veggies and fruits, but also meat and seafood, especially fish. So yeah, that would suck pretty bad. Anyways, I've just explained some of these consequences for bystanders, but the situation in Europe itself is way worse. This water shortage has the areas of fire danger growing rapidly, and huge rivers, which are essential to fishing and the transportation of cargo, and therefore world trade, run very low on water. This goes up to a point where parts of them even dry out. That means hundreds of tons of dead fish. Meanwhile, farmers use around 100 liters or 26.5 gallons of water per cow per day. But Baptiste Coulson, the 31-year-old head of the local Young Farmers Union in Molloy, said his animals would be suffering with the quality and quantity of their milk decreasing. But you can't really blame anybody. I mean, sure, the farmers are using their fair amount of water, but that's what feeds them. Apart from that, the agricultural damage is enormous. According to S&P Global Commodities Insights, EU corn production is expected to be around 12.5 million tons below last year, and sunflower production is projected to be approximately 1.6 million tons lower. And I see that this topic is quite long already, so these were some insights on some consequences of the drought for both bystanders and people living in Europe. But now to the question where all this water is going. I mean, yeah, it's being used, but it's not like all used water is just gone. We have a water cycle which would normally lead the water to rain back down on Earth after it's cleaned. Well, as clean as rain gets. But that isn't the case anymore in our modern world. While some water is bound in crops, big parts of it still evaporate. This steam, or let's call them clouds, are then transported around the world by wind. Among other things, that led to huge floods in Australia, for example, which we covered in several videos as well. Now, normally there's a jet stream that brings Atlantic moisture back to Europe. But this jet stream was weakened by climate change, so there's only little water arriving there. So, not that surprisingly, the drought's all our fault. And experts say that drought periods like this one are very likely to grow in frequency and intensity. And yeah, what should I say? We really need to get our shit together. And the next topic demonstrates this as well. Until now, food-related emissions of greenhouse gases were estimated to account for around 20% or a fifth of all emissions. But sure, that doesn't surprise in the slightest. With farm animals of all sorts blasting methane into the air like it's nothing to worry about, and considering how important food is for our society, this seems fairly acceptable. Of course, only when looking at other industries which emissions could be reduced, like the gas and oil industry for example. But new modeling techniques and a study by the European Commission suggests a whole other dimension of food-related emissions. Considering all the steps that take food from the farm to our plates to the landfill, such as transportation, processing, cooking and food waste, that study brought food-related emissions up from 20% to 33%. That's a third of Earth's emissions. Amos Tai, an environmental scientist at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, says that in order to slow climate change, we need to give our food major attention, just like fossil fuel burning. this also shows us that we need to make drastic changes to the food system, or otherwise we won't reach international goals for reducing global warming. That means if we ever had a chance to. But enough with that. What's going on in Ukraine? We didn't hear about that in a while. Well, not much changed. As one of my viewers politely pointed out under a past video, Russia changed its strategy from a 2-day war to slowly occupying Ukraine bit by bit. But that's nothing new. What's new though is that we almost had a nuclear disaster on Thursday. Because that day, the Russian-occupied nuclear power plant Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine was disconnected from Ukraine's power grid, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said. And Zaporizhzhia is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. So this would have been some disaster. But thanks to backup electricity, the plant could continue operating safely. Since Russian troops occupied the power plant very early on in the war, fires around and within the facility had concerned the world, and it seems like these fires now interfered with power lines connecting the Zaporizhzhia plant, but it was soon reconnected to Ukraine's power grid to avoid catastrophe, and hopefully it'll stay that way. Apart from that, it's the same old story. Soldiers fighting and dying, heavy arms being delivered to Ukraine by multiple countries, and dying economies that have living costs skyrocketing. Another interesting thing in connection with the war is a conference on nuclear disarmament. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is reviewed by its 191 signatories every 5 years, aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Normally, this conference would have been in 2020, as the previous one was all the way back in 2015, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this several weeks long gathering of representatives began on August 1st, 2022. But after participants in 2015 failed to reach an agreement, this year's conference wasn't much better. Russia, for example, objected to a draft text citing grave concern over military activities around Ukraine's nuclear power plants, in particular previously mentioned Zaporizhzhia. Multiple people, among them being the US representative Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins or the Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong, criticized Russia's actions and lamented the outcome of this conference since, and I quote, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, in a year when a nuclear-armed state invaded a non-nuclear-armed state, a meeting of nearly all countries in the world failed to take action on nuclear disarmament. And let's be completely honest, I don't see such an agreement happening even 100 years from now. Well, that didn't lighten up my mood a bit, which is understandable since these were mostly bad news. But you know what could be a little light at the horizon, promising better times with a touch of good feelings? This week's bonus fact. Many people think that faking a smile doesn't actually make them happier, but they're wrong. Because by smiling, even when you're not feeling like it, you can trick your brain into thinking there's something to smile about. So just smiling at random occasions is scientifically proven to lighten up your mood. You should try it sometime.